Friends, thank you for being here today. On October 13th, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce took the extraordinary step of banning all semiconductor exports from Nexperia, a Dutch chipmaker caught in the crossfire of American pressure and Chinese retaliation. Within hours, a company producing 100 billion chips annually for automotive, industrial, and consumer electronics found itself paralyzed, its Chinese facilities accounting for 80% of production suddenly forbidden from shipping products to Europe and beyond. The Netherlands had seized control of Nexperia just days earlier on September 30th, invoking emergency legislation from 1952 to forcibly remove its Chinese CEO after Washington threatened to add the company to America's Entity List, a designation that would effectively ban U.S. companies from doing business with Nexperia. This is not merely a corporate dispute or isolated trade friction. It is the unveiling of America's most dangerous strategy yet in the economic war against China. Weaponizing allies by forcing them to choose sides, even when that choice costs them billions in trade, thousands of jobs, and fundamental sovereignty over their own companies. How can the United States, which spent decades building a rules-based international order premised on free markets and national sovereignty, now openly coerce allied democracies to nationalize private companies based on ownership concerns? How can Washington demand that the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and South Korea sacrifice their own economic interests, destroy their business relationships with the world's second-largest economy, and subordinate their industrial policy to American strategic objectives, all while maintaining the fiction that this is about security rather than economic dominance? The explanation extends far beyond the semiconductor industry or China's technological ambitions. It is a narrative of imperial overreach disguised as alliance management, economic warfare masquerading as national security, and the transformation of America's allies from partners into vassals whose sovereignty exists only when it aligns with Washington's geopolitical objectives. The Nexperia crisis represents the most visible manifestation of a fundamental shift in American strategy toward China. For years, the United States employed traditional tools of economic warfare, tariffs on Chinese imports averaging 19.3% by 2025, export controls on advanced semiconductors and manufacturing equipment, sanctions on Chinese technology companies like Huawei and SMIC, and diplomatic pressure to exclude Chinese firms from 5G networks across allied nations. Yet these measures, while economically painful for China, failed to achieve their stated objective of containing Chinese technological advancement. China's semiconductor industry, despite being cut off from cutting-edge lithography machines and advanced chip designs, continued developing. Chinese companies achieved breakthroughs in 7-nanometer chip production without access to ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography systems. China's electric vehicle industry surged ahead of American and European competitors, dominating global markets with companies like BYD and CATL. The old playbook wasn't working. Washington's new strategy recognizes a fundamental reality. American economic power alone cannot contain China's rise. China is now the world's largest trading partner for over 120 countries, more than double the number for the United States. Bilateral trade between China and the European Union reached $850 billion in 2024, dwarfing U.S.-EU trade of $720 billion. China accounts for 30% of global manufacturing output compared to America's 16%. Any serious effort to economically isolate China requires not just American action, but coordinated restrictions across all major economies: Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And therein lies the problem. These allies have far more economic exposure to China than the United States does. They cannot simply decouple without devastating their own economies. So Washington developed a new playbook: force them to choose through a sophisticated combination of threats, inducements, and the strategic use of America's remaining points of leverage in the global economy. The entity list has emerged as Washington's primary coercion tool against allies as much as adversaries. Administered by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, the entity list designates foreign companies deemed threats to U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. Companies on the list cannot receive exports of American technology, software, or components without special licenses that are almost never granted. This sounds reasonable as a national security measure until you understand the expansive definition of American technology that Washington now employs. Under rules expanded in September 2024 and tightened further in September 2025, the entity list covers not just products made in America, but any product anywhere in the world that contains more than a minimal threshold of U.S. origin technology, uses American software in its design or manufacturing, or is produced by equipment that itself contains U.S. components. The long arm of American technological dominance means that being added to the entity list effectively cuts a company off from global supply chains entirely. The number of Chinese entities on the list has exploded from approximately 600 in 2020 to over 1,200 by 2024, then to more than 3,000 by October 2025. The September 2025 expansion implemented a particularly aggressive provision. Any subsidiary that is 50% or more owned by a company already on the entity list is automatically subject to the same restrictions. This provision directly targeted Nexperia, which is wholly owned by Wingtech Technology, a Chinese company added to the entity list in December 2024. The new rule meant that unless Nexperia's ownership structure changed, meaning unless the Dutch or Chinese governments forced Wingtech to divest, Nexperia would be added to the entity list on November 30th, 2025. For a company that depends on American semiconductor design software, manufacturing equipment containing U.S. components, and access to customers who themselves use American technology, entity list designation would be a corporate death sentence. This is how Washington weaponizes allies, create an impossible choice with a ticking clock. Dutch officials received clear messaging from the U.S. Commerce Department and State Department throughout September 2025. Either take control of Nexperia and remove Chinese management, or watch the company be destroyed by entity list designation, taking with it 5,200 European jobs at facilities in the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom, plus billions in annual economic output. Court documents released in mid-October revealed the explicit nature of American pressure. U.S. officials told Dutch counterparts that Nexperia's CEO Zhang Shuizheng would need to be replaced if the Netherlands wanted to avoid entity list designation. There was no ambiguity, no diplomatic hedging, just a straightforward ultimatum delivered to a supposedly sovereign ally about who could run a private company operating within its borders. The Netherlands capitulated on September 30th, with Economy Minister Mickey Caramans invoking the 1952 Economic Competition Act to assume temporary control of Nexperia. The justification cited serious governance shortcomings and concerns that crucial technological knowledge and capabilities might leave Europe. But the real reason, acknowledged in leaked communications to Dutch parliament members, was American pressure. The Hague chose to seize a private company rather than defy Washington's demands. A Dutch court suspended CEO Zhang Shuizheng on October 1st, citing his attempts to transfer production orders to other Wingtech-owned facilities in China and his efforts to dismiss executives who opposed such moves. These actions, the court ruled, were not in Nexperia's interest, even though they were arguably perfectly rational business decisions by a CEO facing imminent catastrophic restrictions imposed by a foreign government. China's retaliation came swiftly and targeted. On October 4th, just 4 days after the Dutch seizure, China's Ministry of Commerce issued export control notice forbidding Nexperia China and its subcontractors from exporting chips, out of China, since Nexperia's Chinese facilities account for 80% of the company's production, manufacturing approximately 80 billion of the 100 billion chips Nexperia produces annually. The ban effectively paralyzed the company. Nexperia's European facilities simply cannot produce enough volume to supply existing customers. The company entered a surreal state of corporate civil war. Dutch government-appointed management in Nijmegen issuing orders that Chinese facility managers in Guangdong and Shanghai received instructions from Beijing to ignore. Employees described receiving contradictory directives from two different command structures, neither of which legally controlled the situation in the other's jurisdiction. The economic damage rippled outward immediately. Nexperia is one of the world's largest producers of discrete semiconductors and MOSFETs, simple but essential chips that regulate power flow in virtually every electronic device. The automotive industry depends especially heavily on Nexperia chips, with the company supplying every major car manufacturer globally. The Alliance for Automobile Innovation, representing manufacturers including General Motors, Ford, Toyota, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, and Honda, released a statement on October 8th, warning that the disruption in Nexperia's supply will cause significant disruptions across the automotive manufacturing supply chain. The statement's understated language conceals a more dire reality. Without Nexperia chips, automobile production lines across Europe, North America, and Asia face shutdowns. These are not sophisticated AI processors or advanced GPUs that can be redesigned around. They are standardized commodity chips that are nonetheless absolutely essential, and qualifying alternative suppliers takes months or years due to automotive industry safety and reliability requirements. The Nexperia crisis is merely the most dramatic recent example of a broader pattern of American coercion of allies in service of the economic war on China. Consider the parallel case of ASML, the Dutch company that manufactures extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machines, the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment in the world, essential for producing cutting-edge chips below 10 nanometers. ASML's machines cost over $150 million each, represent the culmination of decades of European technological development, and give ASML an effective global monopoly on EUV technology. China's SMIC desperately wants EUV machines to produce advanced chips domestically. ASML would happily sell to SMIC. Each machine sale represents hundreds of millions in revenue. The Dutch government sees no security threat from such sales, since ASML machines cannot be used for military applications, and China obtaining a few machines would not materially change the strategic balance. Yet ASML has not sold a single EUV machine to China since 2019, and the Dutch government officially banned such sales in 2023. Why? American pressure. Washington argued, correctly, that EUV machines contain some U.S. origin components and software, giving America veto power over their export under U.S. law. But Washington went further, making clear to The Hague that EUV sales to China would damage U.S.-Dutch relations across other domains: intelligence sharing, defense cooperation, American military presence in Europe. The Netherlands, a country of 17 million people whose security depends on NATO and American military commitment, could not risk defying Washington over commercial interests of a private company. So ASML lost billions in potential Chinese sales. The company's CEO estimated $5.7 billion in lost 2024-2025 revenue because Washington demanded it. This is not alliance. This is vassalage. Japan faces similar coercion over Tokyo Electron and other Japanese semiconductor equipment manufacturers that produce critical tools for chip production. South Korea endures intense pressure regarding Samsung and SK Hynix, whose advanced memory chips China desperately needs. In each case, the pattern repeats. Washington identifies a choke point in Chinese technology supply chains that runs through an allied country, then demands the ally cut off that supply regardless of the commercial cost. Allies that hesitate receive gentle reminders of their security dependence on the United States and pointed questions about whether their commitment to the alliance is truly ironclad. This is how empire works in the 21st century, not through colonies and gunboats, but through strategic dependencies and coerced compliance disguised as alliance management. The human cost of this weaponization falls first on workers and communities in allied nations that must sacrifice their economic interests for American strategic goals. Consider the situation of Jan de Vries, a 43-year-old senior engineer at Nexperia's facility in Nijmegen, who spoke to Dutch newspaper NRC Handelsblad under a pseudonym to avoid retaliation. "I've worked here for 18 years, de Vries explained. "We built this company from a small Philips subsidiary into a global leader. Our Chinese colleagues in Guangdong and Shanghai are talented engineers, good people who we've worked alongside for years. Now we're told there's security threats, that our Chinese ownership is unacceptable. But nothing has changed about the company. The only thing that changed is American geopolitics. Half our production is frozen because of politics in Washington and Beijing that have nothing to do with semiconductors. We face possible layoffs not because of business failure, but because our company has become a pawn in someone else's game." De Vries's story illuminates the fundamental injustice of weaponizing allies. Dutch workers at Nexperia, German employees at Nexperia's Hamburg facility, British engineers at the company's Manchester site, none of them chose to be involved in the U.S.-China rivalry. They worked for a profitable company that happened to have Chinese ownership, producing commodity chips with no military applications, serving customers worldwide. American pressure turned their company into a geopolitical battlefield where their livelihoods became collateral damage in a conflict they neither started nor benefit from. This is what weaponizing allies means in human terms, forcing ordinary workers in allied nations to sacrifice jobs, career stability, and economic security to serve American strategic objectives they have no voice in determining. The broader economic consequences extend well beyond Nexperia or ASML to affect entire industries and national economies across America's allied nations. The European semiconductor industry has invested over $120 billion in the past 5 years to build production capacity, research facilities, and supply chain infrastructure. Much of this investment explicitly included plans for Chinese partnerships, technology sharing agreements, and access to Chinese markets as customers. Now, American pressure demands that Europe decouple from the world's largest market, effectively requiring European companies to write off billions in investments and forego trillions in future revenue. The EU's CHIPS Act, announced in February 2023 with grand ambitions to build European semiconductor sovereignty, makes little economic sense if European companies are forbidden from selling to 30% of the global market. Yet this is precisely what American demands for Allied participation in China containment require. The incoherence runs deeper. Washington says it seeks to protect democratic values and market economies from authoritarian state capitalism. Yet the methods employed, forcing allied governments to seize private companies, dictating which businesses can operate in which markets, punishing commercial decisions based on political criteria, are the very tactics Washington condemns when China employs them. When China bans Australian coal imports for political reasons, Washington rightfully calls it economic coercion. When the United States threatens to destroy a Dutch company unless the Netherlands seizes it from Chinese ownership, Washington calls it national security policy. The intellectual and moral inconsistency is staggering, yet apparently invisible to the policymakers in Washington who genuinely believe they are defending a rules-based international order while systematically violating its fundamental principles. The weaponization of allies extends beyond semiconductors to nearly every domain of advanced technology. In telecommunications, Washington successfully pressured most European and Five Eyes nations to exclude Huawei equipment from 5G networks, despite European telecommunications executives insisting that Huawei offered superior technology at lower costs than Western alternatives. The campaign succeeded not through evidence of actual security vulnerabilities, none has been publicly demonstrated, but through raw pressure, either ban Huawei or face American retaliation in intelligence sharing and defense cooperation. Britain's initial decision to allow limited Huawei participation in 5G networks reversed within months after American threats became explicit.
The financial cost to European telecommunications companies and consumers who must now use more expensive, less advanced equipment, estimated at $62 billion across the EU, according to analysis by the European Commission's Telecom Industry Association.
In artificial intelligence and cloud computing, American pressure escalates. Washington now demands that allied nations restrict Chinese companies' access to cloud computing services based in allied territory, arguing that Chinese firms could use rented computing power to train AI systems with military applications. This demand requires allied governments to effectively nationalize commercial decisions about which customers' businesses can serve. Ordering private cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud to refuse Chinese customers regardless of commercial considerations. The precedent this establishes is extraordinary. The United States arrogating to itself the right to determine not just what American companies can do, but what European, Japanese, and Korean companies can do with their own infrastructure in their own countries. The rare earth crisis that erupted in October 2025 demonstrates how China can exploit the vulnerabilities created by America's weaponization strategy. On October 9th, China announced dramatic expansions of rare earth export controls, requiring licenses for exporting products containing even minimal amounts of rare earth elements and demanding disclosure of end-use applications. Since China controls 70% of global rare earth mining and 90% of rare earth processing, these restrictions threaten to cripple industries worldwide that depend on rare earth magnets, catalysts, and other materials essential for everything from electric vehicles to wind turbines to guided missiles. President Trump responded by threatening an additional 100% tariff on all Chinese imports and vowing to restrict exports to China of American software, a threat that would devastate U.S. technology companies and likely be ruled illegal if implemented. Yet here is the deeper problem. American weaponization of allies has alienated the very nations whose cooperation is essential for reducing Chinese rare earth dominance. Australia possesses vast rare earth deposits, but has been hesitant to invest billions in developing processing facilities, partly due to fears that American political volatility might leave them stranded. What if the next U.S. administration reverses course on China policy after Australia has restructured its industry around American demands? European nations face similar calculations. When the United States demands that allies sacrifice immediate economic interests for long-term strategic goals, but American politics might reverse those strategic goals within 4 years, allies naturally hesitate to commit. America's inability to maintain consistent policy across administrations, combined with its increasingly coercive treatment of allies, erodes the trust necessary for the very coordination Washington claims to seek. The counterproductivity of weaponizing allies becomes clear when examining the actual results. Has American coercion of allies successfully contained Chinese technological advancement? The evidence suggests the opposite. Cut off from Western semiconductor equipment, China doubled down on domestic research and development, increasing government subsidies to Chinese semiconductor firms by 180% between 2020 and 2025. Chinese companies have achieved repeated breakthroughs that Western experts claimed were impossible without access to restricted Western technology. SMIC producing 7-nanometer chips, YMTC developing 232-layer NAND flash memory, Huawei releasing smartphones with advanced 5G capabilities despite supposedly crippling sanctions. Every restriction imposed by Washington and forced upon allies has accelerated Chinese determination to achieve technological self-sufficiency. The economic war meant to cripple Chinese technology has instead created the world's most focused and lavishly funded industrial policy campaign with results that increasingly threaten Western technological leadership. Meanwhile, the economic and political damage inflicted on allies creates the conditions for precisely the alliance fragmentation that benefits China. European publics and business communities increasingly resent American demands that they sacrifice their economic interests for American strategic goals. Polling conducted across EU member states in September 2025 by the European Council on Foreign Relations found that 58% of Europeans believe the United States is trying to use Europe as a tool in its rivalry with China rather than treating Europe as an equal partner. That sentiment grows stronger in the business community, where majorities in every major European economy report that American pressure to decouple from China threatens European competitiveness and prosperity. Political leaders face growing pressure to assert European strategic autonomy, to define European interests independently from American demands and resist coercive pressure from Washington. The strategic implications of this allied resentment are profound. The United States needs allied cooperation to effectively compete with China across technological, economic, and eventually military domains. If allies comply with American demands only under duress, resentfully, and with minimal commitment, the resulting coordination will be fragile and ineffective. If American pressure eventually provokes Allied revolt, European nations deciding they must chart independent courses, even if that means some distancing from Washington, the consequences for American global position would be catastrophic. The United States cannot maintain its role as global leader if its allies view it as an unreliable bully rather than a trusted partner. Yet current American strategy treats allies exactly that way, apparently blind to how its short-term coercive successes create long-term strategic vulnerabilities. The Nexperia case crystallizes these contradictions in a single company's fate. As of October 23, 2025, the situation remains deadlocked. China continues banning exports from Nexperia's Chinese facilities. The Netherlands maintains government control of the Dutch headquarters. Zhang Shuizheng remains suspended from his CEO position. Wingtech, Nexperia's Chinese parent, has filed multiple legal challenges in Dutch and European courts, arguing that the seizure violates Dutch law, EU single market principles, and international investment treaties. The company's European employees face possible layoffs as customers shift to alternative suppliers. Chinese employees in Guangdong and Shanghai continue working but cannot ship products, creating stockpiles of unsellable inventory. The automotive companies that depend on Nexperia chips scramble to find alternatives before their existing inventories run out in 6 to 8 weeks. There are no winners, only escalating losses as two rival great powers use a company and its workers as proxies in their broader conflict. Is this sustainable? Can the United States maintain a strategy of weaponizing allies indefinitely without destroying the alliances such strategy claims to defend? The question has no comfortable answer. On one hand, allies' security dependence on America remains real. Europe cannot defend itself without American military commitment, and Asian allies face genuine threats from China that require American security guarantees. These dependencies give Washington enormous leverage that will not disappear soon. On the other hand, every exercise of that leverage for economic coercion erodes the trust, goodwill, and sense of common purpose that ultimately hold alliances together. Alliances built purely on coercion and dependency rather than genuine common interests and mutual respect are fragile. They fracture when pressures become too great or when alternatives become available. Washington's current approach seems designed to test exactly how much strain these alliances can endure. The deeper question concerns American grand strategy and whether current policy serves genuine American interests. Assume for the moment that Washington's goal is legitimate, preventing China from achieving technological parity with the West in domains critical for military power, economic dominance, and global influence. Does weaponizing allies actually serve this goal? Or does it accelerate the very outcomes Washington fears Chinese technological self-sufficiency achieved through massive state investment, allied resentment that fragments Western coordination and Chinese success in portraying itself to developing nations as a more reliable partner than an increasingly coercive America? Strategic wisdom requires honest assessment of whether chosen methods achieve intended goals or inadvertently produce opposite results. Current American policy seems to reflect more frustration, anger, and determination to do something about China than careful calculation of whether these actions will actually work. The Nexperia crisis, the ASML coercion, the telecommunications equipment bans, the rare earth restrictions, the entity list expansions, all of it points toward a fundamental transformation in American strategy from alliance leadership based on common values and mutual interests to imperial management based on coercion and vassalage. This transformation occurs without deliberate choice or public debate. No American president declared, "We will now treat our allies as subordinates whose sovereignty exists only when it serves our interests." Instead, policy accumulated incrementally through individual decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Of course, we should restrict Chinese access to critical technology. Obviously, our allies should cooperate. Naturally, we should use our leverage to ensure compliance. The cumulative result is a relationship with allies that increasingly resembles what Washington condemns in China's relationships with its neighbors: asymmetric, coercive, and premised on dominance rather than partnership. Whether this transformation serves American interests depends on time frame and assumptions. In the short term, American coercion succeeds, allies comply, Chinese companies face restrictions, American policymakers feel they are doing something about the China threat. In the medium term, the costs accumulate. Allied resentment grows, Chinese determination and investment in self-sufficiency intensify, American technology companies lose global market share, and the credibility of American leadership erodes. In the long term, the question becomes existential. Can American global position survive the loss of genuine allied loyalty and the transformation of alliances into relationships of convenience maintained only through coercion? Will the weaponization of allies ultimately prove to be the tactic that won battles but lost the larger strategic competition? These questions cannot be answered definitively in October 2025, but the trajectories are concerning for anyone who believes American leadership should rest on attraction rather than coercion, on common values rather than threats, on genuine partnership rather than vassalage disguised as alliance. The employees of Nexperia, Dutch engineers in Nijmegen, German technicians in Hamburg, British specialists in Manchester, Chinese workers in Guangdong and Shanghai, face these abstract strategic questions as concrete personal crises. Will they have jobs in 6 months? Will their company survive? Will their skills and experience be valued or rendered worthless by political decisions beyond their control? They are the human face of what weaponizing allies means. ordinary workers in allied nations transformed into casualties of a geopolitical rivalry they neither chose nor benefit from, sacrificed in service of American strategic objectives that may not even achieve their intended goals. Their fate deserves more consideration than it receives in the strategic calculations of Washington policymakers who view them as mere variables in great power competition rather than human beings with lives, families, and dignity that should matter.